Hi, my name is Andrew Gustafson. I'm the curator of interpretation for the Johnson County Museum. We're thrilled you all came out tonight. I know it's snowing a little bit, but I heard the roads are still pretty decent, so that's great. We're excited for this program. This is the first in a series all year long of programs related to our newest special exhibit called Redlined: Cities, Suburbs, and Segregation. That's on display now in our special exhibit gallery. It'll be up for the entire year through January 7th, 2023, so lots of opportunities to engage in that exhibit, in these programs that we're offering. And we're also working with about 24 institutions across the metro, and actually reaching from Wichita to St. Louis, who are offering programs at their institutions relating to redlining, its foundations, and its legacies in 2022. So tonight I'm going to introduce Dr. Carmaletta Williams. She earned her BA and MA degrees from UMKC and a PhD from KU. All her degrees are in English, and she had a long career teaching English and African American studies at Johnson County Community College, where she was the founding executive director of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. She's also taught in Wuhan, People's Republic of China, in Accra, Ghana, Paris, France, Guinea, West Africa, and in the American School of The Hague in the Netherlands. A limited list of her publications include Do Nothing Till You Hear From Me, Langston Hughes in the Classroom, My Dear Boy, Letters from Carrie Hughes to Langston Hughes, study guides on Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, Of Two Spirits, African American and Native American Racial Identity Formation, and 2 children's books. And most interestingly to me, she received an Emmy for her portrayal of Zora Neale Hurston. I did not know that. She currently serves as the executive director of the Black Archives of Mid-America in Kansas City, Missouri. Tonight she'll be talking about free did not mean welcome, so please welcome Dr. Carmaletta Williams.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Andrew's a doll to work with. We had fun. And I was making suggestions to him of people that he should probably contact, and he said, oh yeah, that's my wife. I'm like, oh, okay, you didn't need me at all. So thanks for being brave souls. Your warrior souls came out, and this, I have to lean into this microphone, they told me. So I'm going to do my best to do that. I'm a mover. I like to move. I like to walk around. So send me a sign if I don't do that. Okay, so my presentation is free did not mean welcome. It was just a symbol, a harbinger of systemic racism. Okay, please come visit the Black Archives of Mid-America. We're in the historic 18th and Vine Jazz District. We're on 17th and Highland. We're right behind the American Jazz Museum, the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, and we share parking lot with the Urban Youth Academy. The Mutual Musicians Foundation is right up the street, and as my friend Bob Kendrick, who's over Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, says, we are the largest concentration of black culture in this country. So please come, bring your friends. We have a coffee shop, we have a gift shop, there's a couple of restaurants you can come have lunch, but we're a nonprofit, but that doesn't mean we can operate without money, so I'm going to encourage you to eat at the Black Archives. Buy a card in the gift shop. So that's what I do now. Arthur Schomburg says, the Negro must remake his past before he can begin to make his future. Jacob Lawrence says, uprooting yourself from one way of life to make your way in another involves conflict and struggle, but out of the struggle comes a kind of power and even beauty. Frederick Douglass said, the dreams of my childhood and the purpose of my manhood were now fulfilled, a free state around me and a free earth under my feet. What a moment was this to me. So the desire to walk freely in a free land as a free person has long been the dream of enslaved people. Ever since, quote, Africa was the privileged hunting ground of Europe and America, and the flag of different nations hung a sign of death on the coast of Congo and Guinea, The idea of freedom and being free has been deeply embedded in the psyche of black people in the United States. Those first shackled steps taken by Africans packed like animals in the hulls of slave ships and brought to the United States to be enslaved were filled with the hope that one day those chains would break and those people would walk the land free to come and go as they pleased. Only a few of those captives ever walked free. Those that did were like Bascom Wade's nameless wife in Gloria Naylor's novel, Mama Day, and the legendary Ibu, whom Paul Marshall so wonderfully describes in Praise Song for the Widow. Bascom Wade's wife, whose name no one can remember but whose legacy no one will ever forget, can never be freed because she was never truly enslaved. However, she got tired of being owned, even if her husband had only been able to lay claim to her body but not her mind. She knew that her husband would never relinquish that control. She had secured freedom for her children, and she had refused to let him own her mind. But one day she tired of having her body owned, and without fanfare or even a farewell, she simply walked to the edge of the East Bluff and flew home to Africa. Gloria Naylor doesn't privilege her readers to know if Mrs. Wade flew home like the flying Africans in Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, did it too fast, or if he simply walked back over the Atlantic. We only know that she got tired of being owned and of not owning anything, so she just returned home to Africa, the place where she was never owned. The Ibu in Praise Song for the Widow would not be owned. They just turned and walked away. When they touched ground on this American land, they walked off the ships, blinked at the sun, looked around, and saw the future. They saw the slavery time and the war, the emancipation and everything after that, right on up to the hard times today. The Igbo gave the white slavers the same hard, long look as they had given their past and their future. Then, without saying a word, they just turned and walked back down to the edge of the river. They just kept walking right out over that river. When they got to where the ship was, they didn't even give it so much as give it a look. They just walked on past it. Didn't want nothing to do with that old ship. Their feet was going to take them wherever they was going that day, and they was singing by then. When they realized there wasn't nothing between them, when they realized there wasn't nothing between them and home but some water, and that wasn't giving them no trouble, they got so tickled they started into singing. Those Igbo just up and walked away not 2 minutes after getting here. The Igbo walked over the river, across the Atlantic, to Africa. They went back home singing. Although authors provide hope for the attainment of freedom for their characters, historical documents reveal that few enslaved people ever made it back home. My ancestors did not have the magical, mythical powers that would have allowed them to walk or fly back home to Africa. For them, as for almost everyone else who was enslaved in this country, there was no home. The land they had been taken from was gone. Mother Africa had been ravaged of hundreds of thousands, some records even say millions, of her children. She lay far away from those who survived, so many unidentifiable miles away at the other end of the Atlantic Ocean. Except for a few of those Africans who were brought to the Americas to be enslaved, most did not have the power or opportunity to just turn and leave. But the action of walking away from those people and elements who would attempt to keep their bodies and their minds captive, restricted, maligned state, became paramount in the psyche of those Africans. It continued today. Time, circumstance, and the relative absence of historical memory have blurred the lines that would allow no choice except for the Africans in the diaspora to identify themselves simply as that, Africans on the other side of the Atlantic. There has to be some recognition that the conditions that caused the Ibu, Bascom Wade's wife, and the flying Africans simply to go back home and not be owned anymore are an intrinsic part of the history of all people of African descent in the Americas. The desire to possess one's own homeland remained in those people from the first steps on diasporic soil to the trudge into bondage and through slavery, until finally millions of African Americans walked away from the South. After emancipation, they were looking for a new place, free from bondage and mistreatment, that they could call home. They looked for freedom, the freedom that emancipation did not provide for them in the South. Zora Neale Hurston reminds us that freedom is a delicate instrument. It's like a cemetery flower. It's rooted in struggle and nourished in blood. Institutional racism, the use of social, political, economic, and violent control of others because of their race, was not new. It had emerged in the form of enslavement for those first African people and has continually asserted itself in other de jure, but largely de facto, racial restrictions imposed on black people. Institutional racism has made the walk to self-agency a very difficult or highly problematic one for black people. Many emancipated black folks recognize that though their people had struggled long and hard and had shed so much blood on this soil that they were unwilling to give any more to the neo-slavery enveloping them in the South, this new form of slavery was a severe form of institutionalized racism, the crop lien system, better known as sharecropping. The night riders, they could no longer be master-slave legal relationships. So essentially the control of the South's labor force came in a new form. This control came with agents of fear, the so-called bulldozers and night riders. Racial terror was the backbone of institutionalized racism. Make them fear you, and you can control them. But black people had already experienced fear and learned that they could survive attempts to break their spirits and control their lives and their families. They didn't just sit down and accept the attitudes of others, read whites, to define their actions and their lives. Instead, they packed up their families and their lives and headed to places that had once represented freedom. Those journeys were not easy. Violence, including murder, often found those who left. For some of those people attempting to leave the systems of racism that endangered their lives, it meant a journey to the north, to Canada, or to the West and the Midwest, particularly to Kansas, a free state. Those people put their faith in the promise implied in the appellation. They became exodusters, fashioned after the biblical story of the Israelites who escaped bondage in Egypt, and by leaving with an exodus. These newly freed people were looking for a place to call home and thought they could find it in Kansas. However, they quickly came to realize that for black people in Kansas, free did not mean welcome. Post-emancipation, but in the shadows of antebellum debates about the place of blacks in Kansas's social fabric, my great-grandfather, Frank Taylor from Alabama, and my great-great-grandfather, Robert Wilson from Tennessee, would find themselves immersed in a rather hostile world. Despite John Brown's freedom fights and a few post-bellum charitable efforts to rescue the exodusters from destitution and despair, Kansans, on the whole, were unwilling to embrace the black pursuit of freedom and literacy, at least on Kansas soil. For the migrant, this world was no doubt one of contradiction, conflict, and uncertainty. Surely Papa Frank and Grandpa Wilson found themselves the legatees of the paradox that defined Kansas. While it struggled to declare itself a free state, it was unable to live up to the promise implied in its name. Kansans fought to write and pass legislation that would allow the territory to be admitted to the Union as a free state only partially on the grounds that they did not want slavery in the state. Slavery would have meant that there would be blacks in Kansas, and Kansans wanted no blacks, free or enslaved within their borders. That message didn't get conveyed to the thousands of African Americans who flooded the state during the Great Migration of 1879. They embraced the state as their Canaan on the promise accompanying the connotation of free. Most of those migrants were certainly disappointed to realize that free didn't mean welcome. The basis for institutionalized racism were already in place. The establishment of Kansas as a free state was rooted in historical imperative that demanded a white population. When Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas decided he wanted federal support to build the Transcontinental Railroad westward from Chicago so that he could improve his district and line his pockets, he sponsored and carried through Congress the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This bill essentially allowed the Nebraska country north of the 37th parallel to be divided into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Douglas's primary intention in developing this legislation was that if the land west of the Mississippi River were organized in territories and rid of Indians, then white men would settle it faster. The growth of a white population in these areas would increase the need for the relatively rapid transportation of goods and people the railroads could provide. Increased use of the railroads translated into increased revenue. If Douglas and his constituents owned the railroads, then they would garner the increased profits, and they in Illinois would prosper. Douglas pushed the legislation through Congress that established the Kansas-Nebraska Act with these motives in mind. But the act had repercussions that far outreached his initial goals. Essentially, what this bill did was to repeal the Missouri Compromise by declaring it inoperative and void and inconsistent with the principle of non-intervention by Congress with slavery in the states and territory, end quote. This is not to say that all white Kansans participated in systemic forms of racism. Abolitionists harbored runaway slaves, hid them in homes along the Underground Railroad route, and provided transportation and financing for their escapes from their owners. They also incited public opinion against slavery. Some Northerners, on the other hand, were not as open in their indictment of slavery. They simply refused to get involved in an argument that had no direct bearing on their lives or their livelihoods. They recognized both the severity and the horrors of slavery, as they did the economic destitution accompanying the loss of a captive labor force. They chose preserving economic systems over human lives. Instead, they ignored the presence of the enslaved around them who, seeking agency for themselves and their families, had escaped. William Lloyd Garrison, possibly the most powerful and certainly the most prolific abolitionist, challenged those Northerners who languished in a noncommittal stance. He said, "Suppose that by a miracle the slaves should suddenly become white. Would you shut your eyes upon their sufferings and calmly talk of constitutional limitations? No. Your voice would peal in the ears of the taskmasters like deep thunder. You would carry the Constitution by force if it could not be taken by treaty. Patriotic assemblies would congregate at every corner of every street. The old cradle of liberty would rock to a deeper one than ever echoed therein at British aggression. The pulpit would acquire new and unusual eloquence from our holy religion. The argument that these white slaves are degraded would not then obtain. You would say, it is enough that they are white and in bondage, and they ought immediately to be set free." You would multiply your schools of instruction and your temples of worship and rely upon them for security, end quote. The limits of the Constitution established a system that did indeed afford a security for white Americans that black Americans could not garner. Enslaved people were always in risk of danger. There was no protection afforded them under the umbrella of the Constitution. Security, especially for those who escaped, was paramount. Few of those people who escaped felt secure enough to live as openly as the great black abolitionist Frederick Douglass. All of them, including Douglass, lived in fear of being returned to slavery and to angry owners. The decision of whether or not to be admitted as a free state was not an easy one for Kansas. The difficulty did not lie in some great moral dilemma involving the ethics of people enslaving other men, women, and children that drove men like John Brown to insanity and murder. Nor was it wrenching at the hearts of the whites in the territory's legislature. They felt none of that. Their dilemma in affecting this decision was purely economic. The men who wanted to develop the Kansas Territory by taking possession of the land that had been promised to the Indians planned to sell the land at a profit. To do so meant there had to be men there who could buy it and men who could work it, white men. The Kansas legislature's decision to be a free state was grounded in their intense desire that there would be no blacks at all in the territory. What to do with Negroes, or as W.B. Du Bois, among so many others, so aptly named it the Negro question, was not of critical importance to the Republicans who had taken control of Kansas. Most Negroes in the territory, however, should have felt some type of affinity with what Du Bois says is the unasked question. How does it feel to be a problem? What to do with black people projected to come to the area, as well as those already in the territory, was a real problem for the Republican legislatures, one they would have preferred not to debate. However, their acceptance of the Free State mandate warranted serious discussion of this issue, as the Free State Convention held at Big Springs and at Topeka in 1855. Most of the conferees felt that there were more important questions to address, like how to create a free state political party. They wanted to focus on issues like establishing a system of securing liberty and self-determination for themselves. They were forced, however, to spend a considerable amount of time discussing means of disenthralling themselves from the slavery which was now fettering them, end quote. The only way to do this, they decided, was not to interact with Negroes at all. They then established a racial exclusion system when they resolved that, quote, the best interest of Kansas require a population of free white men, and that in our state organization we are in favor of stringent laws excluding all Negroes, bond or free, from the territory, end quote. The decision was expedient, to be sure, but it was also deeply rooted in racism. Booker T. Washington, 50 years before Booker T. Washington urged Negroes to cast down their buckets where they could remain as separate as the fingers of the hands, Kansans had already made the same determination. They would not interact with Negroes, enslaved or free, socially or politically. At the Topeka Conference, this issue was confronted and addressed again. Institutional racism systems were put in place. Negroes were excluded from voting, holding office, or serving in the militia. The conferees passed a referendum on Negro exclusion by a 3-1 margin, demonstrating the overwhelming anti-Negro sentiment of the whole. In a proclamation that also included mulattoes, the Topeka Convention issued a proclamation signed by the Executive Committee. It said, the qualified electors of the territory express their approval of the passage of laws providing for the exclusion of free Negroes from Kansas, end quote. Those white legislators had essentially claimed the land as belonging only to them, only to white people. Nearly 50 years later, Du Bois took exception to that attitude, which still prevailed. He said, "Your country? How came it yours? Before the Pilgrims landed, we were here. Here we brought our three gifts and mingled them with yours, a gift of story and song, soft, stirring melody in an ill-harmonized and unmelodious land. The gift of sweat and brawn to beat back the wilderness, conquer the soil, and lay the foundations of this vast economic empire 200 years earlier than your wheat cans could have done it. The third, a gift of the Spirit. Would America have been America without her Negro people?" McDowell and John Greer, a Republican from Topeka, argued stringently for elimination of Negroes from Kansas or strict segregation of those who stayed. Greer argued that it would be an extravagant mistake, end quote, to mix the races socially or in schools. White children, he argued, should not be exposed to Negroes because of the, quote, consequences growing out of a mixture of races, end quote. Besides, he argued, association governs conduct. I'm opposed to giving the Negro and mulatto either the political privilege or the social privileges which we claim for ourselves, end quote. They claimed every political, social, and economic privilege for themselves. Public sentiment ran strongly segregationist. In 1861, the state legislature enacted legislation that allowed district school superintendents of education the right to establish separate schools for Negroes and white. There was no equal, either implied or explicit. The Plessy v. Ferguson decision that established the doctrine of separate but equal wasn't enacted for another 37 years. Through referenda, the legislators were able to establish a system that controlled the access to public accommodations for Negroes already in Kansas. Restricting the immigration of free blacks to Kansas would have to be handled in a different manner. Richard Cordley of Lawrence asserted the futility of these debates on restricting Negro access to Kansas. He said, "The Negroes are not coming. They're here. They will stay here. They are American-born. They've been here for more than 250 years. They're not going to South America. They're not going to other parts of our land. They are with us to stay. They are to be our neighbors, whatever we may think about it, whatever we may do about it," end quote. Endless hours of debate on the issue would have little impact on the reality. Not only were Negroes already in the territory, many more were coming for a myriad of reasons. Kansas Senator James Lane, without authorization and against instructions from Washington, began recruiting a large contingent of Negroes into the territory to serve in the Union ranks as early as 1861. Several thousand escaped people sought solace in the territory between 1860 and 1862. Corley's pronouncement was accurate. They are here. In order to avoid establishing specific black laws, the conferees handled the Negro question by public referenda. They set a system of institutionalized racism. Although there were laws giving exclusive privilege to white men, no laws specifically disenfranchising blacks existed. None were needed. On March 6, 1857, 3 years after the first of Thayer's settlers from the New England Immigrant Aid Company founded the town of Lawrence, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, had been taken to Illinois, a free state, from Missouri, a slave state, and then into Wisconsin Territory, which was free under the terms of the Missouri Compromise. Scott lived in these free territories for over 5 years. His owner then took him back to Missouri. Members of a family that had once owned Scott befriended him on his return to Missouri. They helped him with his case to prove that because he had lived so long in free states, he should be free. A lower court ruled that indeed Scott should be free. The case was overturned on appeal. Finally, the case reached the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's decision regarding Scott made 2 points abundantly clear. One, the U.S. Constitution was a pro-slavery document. And two, enslaved were property, not people with rights. Charles Johnson and Patricia Smith succinctly summarized the effect of Judge Taney's words. They said, "The decision confirmed the entire experience of black people since the founding of this nation. Only now the humiliation was official." The court declared that Scott, and by extension all enslaved people, were not citizens of the United States or even the state of Missouri, and by extension Kansas, and had therefore no right to sue in court. The court continued in its pronouncement and determined that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because Congress had no power to exclude slavery from the territories. The court based this decision on the Fifth Amendment, which prohibited Congress from depriving any person of, quote, property without due process of law, end quote. The justice recognized that simply to outwardly declare slavery the law of the land would have sounded a death knell to the survival of the United States. Their decision instead essentially granted sovereignty to each state to decide whether that state would be slave or free. Abolitionists were severely upset and disappointed with the Dred Scott decision. The court's ruling that Congress had no right to ban slavery anywhere in the United States, and not that it ever would, signaled a wide emanation of slavery throughout the territories. Their reaction, according to Frederick Douglass, came from a new form of abolitionism. He said, opposing slavery and hating its victims became a very common form of abolitionism. They meet colored men on their thresholds and say, "We care not how temperate and industrious you may be. We want none of you here. This is a government of white men," end quote. Systemic racism was finally in place. The Dred Scott decision gave Kansans all the latitude they needed to feel justified in wanting to keep blacks, whether free or enslaved, from the territory. In 1852, the United States Supreme Court's ruling in this case made it abundantly clear that the U.S. Constitution was written for the protection and interest of white men only. Justice Taney's ruling in the decision set the attitudes that would foster and nurture the racism in this country, which continues to this present day. The Supreme Court, in decreeing the inferiority of Negroes, gave Kansas more fuel for its segregationist fodder. Negroes, Taney declared, in fact, quote, had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever a profit could be made by it. This opinion was at that time fixed and universal in the civilized portion of the white race. It was regarded as an axiom in morals as well. A Negro of the African race was regarded as an article of property and held and bought and sold as such in every one of the 13 colonies which united in the Declaration of Independence and afterward formed the Constitution of the United States. The slaves were more or less numerous in the different colonies as slave labor was found more or less profitable. But no one seems to have doubted the correctness of the prevailing opinion of our time, end the quote. Judge Taney's declaration of Negro inferiority and lack of rights provided the narrow-minded judicial platitudes on which the legislators in the Kansas Territory would ground their biased ideology. The white man in Kansas certainly did not respect the Negro or feel bound to honor any of a Negro's rights. However, with or without Taney's pronouncement, the legislators' attitude of exclusion was already in place. Kansans wrestled with the dilemma of how to frame their argument and thus structured the law regarding blacks, especially slaves in the state. The citizenry was divided almost 2-1. By the slightest allowable margin, however, 1 vote, the legislature decided to disenfranchise Negroes in the territory. They also laid to rest the question of whether to be free or slave state. In July 1859, Section 6 of the Bill of Rights of the Wyandotte Constitution declared that except for, quote, crimes of an unspecified nature, there would be no slavery or involuntary servitude in the state of Kansas. The decision was completely self-serving. The legislators appropriated the land that had been promised to the Indians for personal profit and wanted it unencumbered by slaves and the slavery issue. The Emancipation Proclamation had reluctantly been signed by President Abraham Lincoln. Black people were leaving the South in unprecedented numbers. Many heard through postings by ex-Duster conductor Pat Singleton that the place to be was Kansas, a free state. However, the word about African American disenfranchisement and social ostracism in the state did not reach migrating Negroes like Papa Frank and Grandpa Wilson, who were looking for a new home and found it in Kansas. They had a free state around them and free earth under their feet. They were those people that the fictional conductor on the Migration Railroad, Ned, wrote about in a letter to his adopted mother, Miss Jane Pittman, in the Ernest J. Gaines novel, The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. Miss Jane says about Ned's post to her, quote, "The letter told how people was coming into Kansas by the boatload. At first, how the white people in Kansas was helping them, how they collected money to give to them, how they organized committees to go to Washington and places like that for money and clothes, money and food. Even from across the sea, they got money and clothes. The people at first was almost too nice, but that was the first letter," end quote. Those African Americans who moved to the state on the power of the promise implied in the name didn't know that the political and social climates were grounded in animosity towards blacks, and they did indeed suffer. The system of institutionalized racism continues to this day. African Americans still encounter racial restrictions instituted in when J.C. Nichols developed redlining, the system of redlining financial maps to exclude financing African American homes and businesses, an action legalized by the City Council of Kansas City, Missouri in 1920. Disparities in health were fought against by African American health care professionals and with the creation of black hospitals. Yet African Americans have contracted and are dying from COVID-19 at an exponential rate of whites. The 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision ingrained in much of the white community that black and white people should remain separate but equal, with extreme racist underpinnings that convinced many whites that they were better than blacks. School systems educating black children operating under the separate but equal system did an amazing job of teaching literacy to African Americans of all ages, but they suffered from loss of finances. The two Brown v. Board of Education decisions began the process of desegregating schools. However, the tax systems did not favor African American children. Those schools were and still are seriously underfunded. Those systems of racism remain stringently in place. We witnessed many of those racist attitudes as political representatives and white nationalists resorted to violence to devalue the black vote, indeed to erase it. The actions of hatred and violence on January 6, 2021, when armed mobs felt privileged by the racial infrastructures in place in the United States and promoted by the president, forced their way into the Capitol to alter the will of the people. We must keep walking. We must walk as those first Africans did as they planted their feet and took wings back home. We must march as thousands of African Americans did as they left the neo-slavery enveloping them in the South. We must keep walking like hundreds of blacks who marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to declare they would not be subverted by a racist system. We must fight systemic racism that hinders our health care, relegates some of our children to a less than adequate educational system, and poisons our water. All of us, black, white, Latinx, Native, and those of diverse nationalities from around the world, must destroy those systems of institutional racism. We do it by saying, enough. It ends here and now. We do it by accepting each other as equals. We do it by making sure there's equity in financial, social, housing, educational, and healthcare access that is provided to all people. We do it by voting and holding our elected officials to account. We get it done by accepting that those old systems of racial restrictions were wrong-headed and unfair. Then we walk away into a new day of social justice and equity for all people. Thank you. Thank you.